superiority of the nature of the gospel. And we'll be more specific about that when we go a little bit further. But Jesus is superior. The gospel is superior. Okay? Faithfulness is appealed to on the basis of the faithfulness of God to his promises. We should be faithful to Jesus because he is superior. We should be faithful to the gospel because it is superior. The new covenant is superior to the old. And we should be faithful to God because of the faithfulness of his promises that we've seen. And that all of this is demonstrated. Faithfulness is appealed to on the basis of the witness of the ancients. Right? Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1. What's that say? Which is really kind of a conclusion of chapter 11. Wherefore, seeing we are compassed with what? So great a cloud of witnesses. Let us run with patience or endurance the race that's set before us. Hebrews chapter 11 is the pinnacle of the book, providing countless witnesses of the faithfulness of God. All right. Here are some mentioned, all I believe mentioned by name in the book, or in the chapter. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham. He's mentioned 2 separate occasions, verses 8 through 10 and then 17 through 19. Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Israel as a nation, Rahab the harlot, Gideon, Barak, which would also include Deborah, I guess you could say, in the Judges, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel and the prophets. And then in verse 35, there are numerous unnamed women and others, verses 36 through 38. Every word of this book is for the purpose of strengthening the faith of the struggling Hebrew Christians. And so I would suggest that faithfulness to Christ and faithfulness to the gospel of Christ is the theme of the book. And I think the use of the term and the other words that we're going to see also lend itself to that. All right? Anybody have a thought of what might be another word? Here's one we haven't mentioned that's going to be number 2 on the list. Anybody? Once. What did you say, Mr. Reese? Love. Okay. Here's the word that is used second. Priest or high priest. Now remember, faithfulness to the gospel, faithfulness to Christ is the superiority of Jesus is appealed to as a basis of being faithful. All right? Priest or high priest is found 26 times in the book of Hebrews. 30 times in the epistles in Paul's writings. 30 times. In the book of Hebrews, it's 26 times. In all but 2 occurrences in Hebrews, and these 2 occurrences is chapter 9 and verse 6 and chapter 10 and verse 11, the term priest either explicitly or implicitly refers to the high priest. And Jesus is our high priest. And the emphasis then is on his high priesthood. So this provides for us a key point of emphasis in the book. The priesthood of Jesus, the superiority of his priesthood over the Levitical priesthood. Now, just some thoughts with regards to that. Since the high priest of Jesus, the high priesthood of Jesus is superior, what might be some things that would follow? Since the high priest of Jesus is superior, then what? For example, here's the first one. The priests in his priesthood are better. Okay? And who are the priests in the priesthood of Jesus? Christians. Okay? So there's a superiority there. What are some other things that might follow? Think about the high priests and priests in the Old Testament. And since Jesus' high priesthood is superior, what else might be better? Do what? Okay. The method of worship is superior. Anything else? The sacrifices are better, or the sacrifice is better. Even though Christians, do we offer sacrifices as priests? 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 5, we do, right? Sacrifices that are acceptable to God by Jesus Christ. Anything else you can think of? All right, I've got 5 thoughts here. Mention the first one, the priests or Christians' superiority. The sacrifice that was mentioned, well, the sacrifice of his... How much better is the blood of Christ than the blood of bulls and goats? You see the emphasis here? All right, the atonement provided in his priesthood is better? What atonement is provided in the priesthood of Jesus? Full remission. Full remission. The covenant by which his priesthood was established is better. Right? And then the promises and blessing pertaining to his priesthood is better. So you see, everything is pointing to superiority of Christ on that one. All right? What might be another term, and see if you can get the third one. First of all, who is Jesus? What is Jesus in comparison to the angels? What is Jesus in comparison to Moses? What is Jesus that the angels were not? What is Jesus that Moses was not? In relation to God, what is Jesus that the angels were not? To which of the angels said he at any time, sit thou on my right hand? All right, Son. Of whom do I hold more dear? Hayden Barnett or Curtis Scherfus? I like Hayden. I love Hayden. I might not always act like I do, but I do. Give him the shirt off my back, okay? I'd probably charge him a little bit for it, but I'd give him the shirt off my back. But who is more dear to me? And that's the point that will be made in the text. All right, the term son, we find it 23 times in the book of Hebrews. One time, in chapter 2, verse 6, what is man that thou art mindful of him, or the son of man that thou visitest him? We see it used there. Another time, he's bringing many sons unto glory. Chapter 2 and verse 10. And then in chapter 7, verse 5, one time as sons of Levi. Okay? So we see the Son of Man, bringing sons unto glory, and then sons of Levi. But then from chapter 11, verse 17 to chapter 12 and verse 8, son is found 8 times, and it's never used of Jesus there. Okay? So you have 1, 2, 3 times, and then 8 times. That's 11. That leaves 12 times in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is referred to as God's Son. Over half the times we'll see the term son. The emphasis on Jesus' relationship to the Father. So that highlights his superior nature. All right, now, somebody read Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 7. Okay, they're referred to as ministers, the angels, okay? Hayden, read verse 9.
You have loved righteousness and hated lawlessness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your companions.
Companions, fellows, the King James said, referring to the angels. Okay, all right, in verse 14. Okay, ministering spirits. But look at Jesus' relationship to God as his son in contrast to the angels. Then, if you consider the Old Testament, who would be the standout men in the Old Testament? Okay, our first one is going to be Abraham. Might be the first one we think of. Who else? Moses. I wonder whose name is mentioned most in the Old Testament, Abraham, Moses, or David. I don't know. That'd be a good, I would lean toward Moses, because how many times do we see, and the Lord said unto Moses, and the Lord said unto Moses, over and over. I would suspect that he perhaps it may be his name used more than any other name. I don't know. But I'm certain it would be ranked very highly. But somebody read Hebrews chapter 3 and verse 5, and notice the comparison made between Jesus and Moses.
And Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, testifying to the things that were to be spoken later.
Okay. Moses was what? Was he faithful? But as what? A servant. Okay. Doug, read verse 6.
But Christ is faithful over God's house as a
Okay, notice that. Christ is superior to the angels. Christ is superior to Moses. Moses certainly was faithful, but he was a servant. Jesus also faithful, but as a son. You see the superiority there. All right, the next one, the fourth term that is used most in the book of Hebrews, and we've noted this already, is blood. Now, this is separate from the sacrifice. Sacrifice is going to imply blood, but the term blood itself is used 22 times in the book of Hebrews. Throughout the epistles, 41 times it's used. So that would mean over half the times it's used in Hebrews. Now, which chapter would you suppose out of these 22 times the term blood is most often found? If you're not very familiar with the book of Hebrews, it might not come right to you. Chapter 9, 12 times, so over half are found in chapter 9. Now, whose blood do you suppose is being emphasized? What's the purpose of the book? To show what? To strengthen the faithfulness of Christians by showing superiority of Christ. Now, blood of the Old Testament came from animals, but the blood of the New Covenant from Christ, showing the superiority. So let's look at Hebrews chapter 9 for just a moment, and let's notice something here with regards to this matter. Hebrews chapter 9. And you see it multiple times. I think maybe the first time, verse 12. Neither by the blood of bulls and goats and calves, but by his own blood he entered into once the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us. There you see the holy place, referring to that, what we would call the most holy place. The high priest went in. Here, Jesus, our high priest, going in with his own blood. Verse 13, for if the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of a heifer sprinkling the unclean sanctified to the purifying of the flesh, how much more shall the blood of Christ, okay? You see the superiority of his blood over the blood of animals under the old law. Look also starting at verse 18. And I want to take, and Hayden, if you would, be turning to Hebrews chapter, not Hebrews, 1 Peter chapter 1, and I want you to read verse 3 in just a moment, okay? Now, watch this. Verse 18 of Hebrews 9. Whereupon neither the first testament or first covenant was dedicated without blood. For when Moses, notice dedicated, do y'all have dedicated in your text, or you have a different word? Inaugurated, okay. For when Moses had spoken every precept to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of calves and of goats with water and scarlet wool and hyssop, and sprinkled both the book and all the people. Now, we have record of that in Exodus chapter 24, verse 7. I'll read it. Exodus 24 and verse 7. And he took the book of the covenant and read in the audience of the people, and they said, all that the Lord has said will we do, and be obedient. And Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, behold the blood of the covenant which the Lord hath made with you concerning these words. All right, now, what is happening here when Moses sprinkles the blood on the people? He reads the covenant. This is the covenant that God is making with you. They say, we will do that, and he sprinkles the blood on them. What, in essence, is happening here? What is this symbolic or figurative of? Bringing them into the covenant. Bring them into the covenant. Okay? Now, the Hebrews writer refers to this. All right, verse 21, back at chapter 9, verse 21. Moreover, he, Moses, sprinkled with blood both the tabernacle and all the vessels of the ministry, sanctifying that, belongs to God. And almost all things are by the law purged with blood. And without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3.
Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead.
Okay, let me read 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 3 in the King James. I think there's a little bit different wording there, unless I gave you the wrong verse. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 2. I'm sorry, read verse 2. I'm sorry. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 2.
Interestingly enough, the NASB kind of combines verse 1 and 2, so I'm not sure exactly where it starts.
Okay, just start at the beginning and read through 2.
Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who reside as strangers, scattered through Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who are chosen according to the foreknowledge of God the Father, by the sanctifying word of the Spirit, to obey Jesus Christ, and be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be multiplied.
Sprinkled with his blood. Notice that figurative language that Peter uses, that's also the Hebrew writer uses, that refers back to that old covenant of bringing them into that covenant with God, sanctifying them. Now here's why I mention that, because some today would go to 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 2 and read that by the sprinkling of the blood, and what will they teach? Baptism is sprinkling. There's that right there. Just the blood that cleanses us. Sprinkling, baptism, sprinkling is acceptable. That's a figurative reference of demonstrating of bringing one into a covenant. And we see that in Exodus, we see it in Hebrews, and we see it there in 1 Peter. So the term blood, 22 times in the book of Hebrews, 12 times in chapter 9, an emphasis on the blood of Christ being superior to the blood of those animals that were sacrificed under the Old Testament. Now, the blood of those animals, what did it do? It sanctified those things. So what about the blood of Christ? Sanctifies. Which is superior? That which is sanctified by the old blood of animals, or that which is sanctified by the new blood of Christ? You see what the Hebrews writer is laying out. Okay, let's look at the next term that is most often used is covenant or testament. Covenant or testament. It's the same term, same Greek term, sometimes translated covenant in the King James, sometimes translated testament, but the Greek term is the same. 21 times the word is used in the book of Hebrews. In the other epistles, that is, it would be the writings of Paul, and in addition to the general epistles, it's used 16 times. So it's used 30% more. Would that be the figure about? In the book of Hebrews. 21 times. 15 of those times is in chapters 8 and 9. We see covenant or testament. So over half are used in chapters 8 and 9. 7 times in chapter 8, 8 times in chapter 9. We read of the Ark of the Covenant, chapter 9 and verse 4. The tables of the covenant, chapter 9 and verse 4. Blood of the covenant is in chapter 10. Also in chapter 3, verse 20, we read of an everlasting covenant. But where do we really read of the term covenant? Where's the emphasis of a covenant? Well, look at chapter 8, and let's start at verse 8. Hebrews chapter 8, and this is going to be a reference back to, really a quotation of Jeremiah chapter 31, and the application is going to be made to the new covenant, okay? Jeremiah chapter 8 and verse 8, for finding fault with them, he saith, behold, the days are come, saith the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Who is Israel and Judah? Let's understand what the Hebrews writers, he's making an application for us of this prophecy. Who is Israel? Who is Judah? In the Old Testament, we know Israel as what? The northern kingdom. We know Judah as the southern kingdom. Collectively, Israel and Judah would be the people of God. And that's what's being said. I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. I'll make a new covenant with my people. Not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day when I took them out of the hand, or took them by the hand, to lead them out of the land of Egypt, because they continued not in my covenant, and I regarded them not, saith the Lord. For this is a covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, saith the Lord. Now, what is the Hebrews writer about to do here? The way he describes this covenant, just watch this, and then think of the old covenant, and notice how he describes the new covenant. And then I want y'all to tell me what he's trying to teach us here. I will put my laws into their mind and write them in their hearts. I will be to them a God. They shall be to me a people. They shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest. What is different from this new, as we just have it described, what's different from the old, with which we've been familiar from the time we were knee-high to the front doorstep and taught it in Bible class? Where was the law written? Initially, where was the law first written? On those tablets of stone. Okay, there it was written. But where is this one going to be written? In their hearts and in their minds. Okay. And then notice, they shall not teach every man his neighbor and every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for all shall know me, from the least of them to the greatest. Okay, question. When a baby was born to Hebrew parents in the days of Moses and after, when they were born, were they in a covenant relationship with God by virtue of being born into a Hebrew family? Or was there a process they had to go through? They were in a covenant relationship with God by virtue of being born into the nation of Israel. Did that mean when they were born into that family, into that nation, they knew who God was? They had to be taught who God was. But they were in a covenant relationship with God, but they didn't know who God was. Now today, how does one come into a covenant relationship with God? Has knowledge of the new covenant and submits to and is washed by the blood, cleansed by the blood by which that covenant was sealed, then they are in a covenant relationship with God. When that one is in a covenant relationship with God, do we then have to teach them who God is? Or must man know who God is before he can be in the covenant relationship with God? Now, what kind of covenant, what kind of law was the old law? It was a physical national. Now, yes, there are spiritual implications and all involved, but what about the new covenant? I'm not going to write it on stone. This will be written in their hearts and in their minds. And so the emphasis here, this is a spiritual covenant. And to be a part of this spiritual covenant, all will know me before they enter into it. As opposed to, so he's drawing strong contrast between the old. And it's also emphasizing the superiority of the new over the old. Hayden?
How would you respond to somebody using this verse falsely to imply that we have our personal Christ, and that it's not based on the law that's been given to us?
Well, how would I respond? I would ask them to explain by that verse that teaches we have a personal Christ. I've honestly never heard that before. I've never had anybody say we have a personal Christ.
I think I said that wrong. My connection to Christ is all that I need through my prayer, through my personal relationship with Christ. We hear that quite often, that I have a relationship with Christ, but you can't tell me a point in a book where I'm wrong, because I have a relationship that may be different than your relationship with Christ.
Okay. Well,
They're saying it's not a covenant relationship.
okay. Matthew chapter 26, verse 28. What's that say? Matthew chapter 26. I believe we started either, is it 28 where we start? Or am I too far back in the chapter? It's the institution of the Lord's Supper. Okay. This is the blood of the new covenant, shed for many for the remission of sin. Okay, if one has and I don't like this terminology, personal relationship with Christ. What did the old pioneer preachers used to say? We should use Bible names for Bible things and teach Bible things in Bible ways. Okay, where do we find the phrase or the teaching of a personal relationship with Christ?
When I hear somebody say that, I ask them, you mean a personal relationship like Judas? Very personal relationship.
Yeah. In order to have, to be a part, in order to have a relationship with Christ, you must be a part of the covenant. To be a part of the covenant, you must be faithful to the covenant as a whole. I can't say I have a relationship that's distinct and separate from the covenant that he instituted. If you're going to have, let's use a biblical term, if you're going to be in fellowship with Christ, you have to be faithful to the covenant, which means what? 1 John chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. Walking in the light, which means what? Acts 2:42. Continuing steadfastly in the apostles' doctrine. There's no place where we read in the scripture, I have my own relationship with Christ, and you can't tell me what kind of relationship I can have, what I have to do, what I can't do. Now, can I tell you what you can do and can't do? No, but who can? Christ does. And what am I doing? I'm simply communicating to you what the covenant states. That's how I would respond to that. In order to have a relationship, and then I'd correct it. In order to be in fellowship with Christ, you have to enter into that relationship, enter into that fellowship by being a part of the covenant, which means keeping the whole covenant. Let's go to the book of James. Thought just came to my mind if I can find the verse. Terminology is something of keeping if you offend in one part of the law, you offend in the whole law. Somebody know exactly where that is? And then I'll try to give some explanation of that. If any man offend in one part of the law, he's guilty of the whole law. What is it? Verse 10, is that chapter 1? Chapter 2 and verse 10. For whosoever shall keep the whole law and yet offend in one point, he is guilty of all. Is that true? That's an inspired statement. They've got to keep the whole covenant. Now let's give an explanation to it, and let's go back to those old pioneer preachers. And I've used this before, so I'll make it short. Man from Europe purchases a tract of land, several acres of land in America. He sends his son over with a layout of the land. And he has it drawn out. Here's where I want you to build the house. Here's where I want you to build a barn. Here's where I want you to put the well. Okay, you go. He goes over there and he looks and he sees, then he knows they're going to have cattle, and he sees, man, look where this barn's going to be. This is a perfect place for this. My father has such a wisdom. The house, man, the house can look and see out over all the property. It is in the perfect place. It's advantageous for the family to be there. It is cosmetically, it's right. Geographically, it's where it needs to be. Let's see where my father's determined to put the well. Why in the world does he want to put the well way over here? That's so far away from where it needs to be. Surely it should be here. And so he puts the barn where his father says, the house where his father says, and he puts the well where he wants. His father comes and looks across the property, and he goes to his son, and he says, you have not obeyed me in one thing. He said, I obeyed you in all but one thing. I obeyed you in the barn, I obeyed you with the house, only not the well. And he said, no. You did not obey me in building the barn where I said, you thought it was good. You did what you wanted to do. You did not obey me by building the house there. You thought it was good. You put it there. Just as you did not obey me with the well. You didn't like where it was. If you would have disagreed with me at the barn and disagreed with me with the house, you wouldn't have put them there. You violated all that I said. That's what James said. Meaning, so verse 10, any man offends in one, he's guilty of all the law. And so one has to, one to be in fellowship with God, with Christ, he must maintain the whole covenant, not just what he decides he wants to. We're to walk in the light, not stand in the glow of it. Some people think they can stand in the glow of the light and be in fellowship with God. So that means we've only got 30 minutes. Is that it? All right. We've only got 4 more words. Promise is the next term. 18 times in the book of Hebrews, 56 in the other letters. 7 times it's in chapter 11. That's where we find it the most. The emphasis in Hebrews chapter 11 is faith. Thus, the faithful receive the promise of God. And the faithfulness of God who made the promise is also highlighted. chapter 11, verse 11, chapter 12, and verse 26. So, promise. The seventh term I have here in our vocabulary of Hebrews is sacrifice. Mention that 17 times in the book of Hebrews, 29 in the other letters. 8 times, so almost half, 8 times in chapter 10. And the discussion in chapter 10 is a contrast between the sacrifices of the old law and the sacrifice of Jesus. Man, I wish we had time to look at it, but you can make a note. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 8 through 14. A body hast thou prepared for me. Well, what was the purpose of the body? Jesus came to this earth to do what for man? That's the easy one. Jesus came to this earth to do what? He came to die. God can't die. Therefore, what was prepared for him so that he could die? A body hast thou prepared for me, that he could be a sacrifice. And so chapter 10 there, 8 times. And in fact, notice how chapter 10 starts. For the law, having a shadow of good things to come, not the very image of those things, can never with those sacrifices. Okay? And so the sacrifice of Christ is set in contrast, and the superiority of that sacrifice is demonstrated in chapter 10 especially. All right, the 8th term most often used, heaven or heavenly. We see that term 15 times. In chapter 3, verse 1, we are partakers of the heavenly calling. Those things that were under the old law were only shadows of heavenly things, chapter 8 and verse 5, and chapter 9, verse 23. And then in chapter 12 and verse 22, we read about the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, the city of the living God. Now I want to note something here, just to kind of maybe provide an answer for some things that are often, I believe, certainly misstated. Trying to find where I want to go. I want to say it's chapter 6. Where do we see Christ is a forerunner? Somebody help me out. In the book of Hebrews, Jesus is referred to as a forerunner. Chapter 6 and verse 20. I thought so. I'm looking right at it. There it is. Okay. Let's don't ring the bell on me. Watch this. Verse 16. For men verily swear by the greater, and an oath for the confirmation is to them an end of all strife. Men, when they come into agreement, an oath is made. The end of all strife. We're in agreement. You agree with me. There's no strife in between us. Okay. Wherein God, willing abundantly to show unto the heirs of the promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by 2 things, the promise of God and the oath that he made concerning the promise. The two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, that we might have a strong consolation who have fled for refuge. I have to look back at the refuge cities in the Old Testament, to lay hold upon the hope set before us. Who is our hope? Christ is. Which hope we have as an anchor for the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. When the high priest went through the veil, where did he go? Now come on, because he's got to ring the bell. When the high priest went into the holy place, and then he walked through the veil, where was he? The most holy place. And the most holy place typified or represented what? Heaven. There's the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat of God, right? Okay. Now, watch this, verse 20. Whither, into the veil in the most holy place, which is heaven, the forerunner is for us entered into. What's a forerunner do? He goes before who? Everybody that's following him, right? Who was the forerunner of Jesus? John was, and Jesus came behind him. Okay? Jesus is our forerunner, and where did he go? Heaven. Where are we going? Heaven. And the reason I make this point is because there are some that suggest, well, it's not heaven. it's a renewed, regenerated earth, or it'll be a newly created something. The Bible says very clearly, Jesus is the forerunner gone in, and that's where we're going, and it's referred to as the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. A new Jerusalem, or a new heaven and new earth, just figurative terms used to refer to that place, a new dwelling place for us. And then lastly, you can ring the bell if you need to, better. 13 times in the book of Hebrews, 23 times in the other New Testament letters. Chapter 1 and verse 4, Jesus is so much better than the angels. Chapter 7, 22, Jesus made a surety of a better testament. 8 and verse 6, a better covenant which is established upon better promises. 10:34, we have a better and an enduring substance in heaven. 11:16, the ancients desired a better dwelling place that is a heavenly, okay? And then 11 verse 35, a better resurrection. Better resurrection. So when we look at the vocabulary of Hebrews, we see from beginning to end, the whole purpose of the book of Hebrews is to strengthen Christians to faithfulness because of the superiority of all things we have in Jesus Christ. That's the book of Hebrews. And you see it very clearly, I think, just by the vocabulary that we find in the book. Well, I appreciate your time and attention. I especially appreciate the overtime. And I'm not even going to charge you. I'm not even going to charge for that overtime.